Professor Friedman, let me ask you what may turn out to be a long and rather convoluted question. You've said that the objectives of the people who have created social security programs, of the people who want to provide for the aged, who want to provide for the poor, who want to achieve objectives that have been identified with minimum wage and social security, that the objectives were valid, and you share them.
Absolutely.
Now, if you share them, how would you have achieved those objectives?
The only way you can achieve them,
How?
in my opinion, which is by voluntary cooperative action. You see, I think there's been one underlying basic fallacy in this whole set of Social Security and welfare measures, and that is the fallacy, this is at the bottom of it, the fallacy that it is feasible and possible to do good with other people's money. Now, you see, that view has two flaws. If I'm going to do good with other people's money, I first have to take it away from them. That means that the welfare state philosophy of doing good with other people's money, at its very bottom, is a philosophy of violence and coercion. It's against freedom, because I have to use force to get the money. In the second place, very few people spend other people's money as carefully as they spend their own. Let me take this down to the situation in New York City right now. About 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, I've forgotten when it was, John Kenneth Galbraith, in an article he wrote in the New York Times magazine section, said, there are no problems in New York City that would not be solved if the New York City budget were twice what it is now. Now, the New York City budget has since then something like tripled, and all the problems are worse. Why? Because the fact is that it's a confusion to identify the city with the people. The New York City's budget is higher, but that means that the people of New York have less to spend. It's only been transferred from people individually to the city. Now, who spends the money more carefully? The city civil servants or people who are spending their own money? Now, of course, you may say to me, but when the city spends the money, it'll go for the good things, and so even half of it is wasted, it's better off. But that's nonsense. City civil servants and others are just like the rest of us. We're all of us interested in pursuing our own objectives. The label, again, on the bottle may be welfare or health or education, but you have to look at all of the places where it drops off en route to going there. There are lots of other things that can be accomplished under those titles, and the fact is that no larger a fraction of the money that the city spends goes to good things. Let me illustrate in a very concrete way. A major problem in New York City is housing. Why? Because of bad governmental policy. Rent control, which was continued in New York after World War II, in the only city in the country where it was continued, everywhere else it was dropped. It has caused enormous abandonment of houses, eroding the tax base. Public housing, governmental subsidy to housing, so that people who occupy it have no incentive to maintain it. If you had eliminated the government from the housing market and left that money in the hands of the people themselves, the housing situation in New York today would be far better than it is.
Professor Friedman, I would like to ask you what you mean by in the hands of the people. You use that notion.
I mean you and me. I mean the people who pay the taxes, who finance the activities which government engages in. If I take Social Security, I mean instead of having a tax of something like 12%, not quite that, on every worker, up to a maximum limit. It's regressive. Instead of having that tax, if I let him have that money himself, he would be able to invest it in a program for his own old age, which would yield him greater benefits than on the average he can get from the amount that he's now paying.
Suppose we grant that and say that that's absolutely true, no question about that. Aren't we in a position, though, of looking back as responsible people to the point at which we had to recognize that many individuals were not doing this?
That's a misconception, I believe, of what the historical circumstance was. There is no doubt that in the Great Depression of the 30s, many people were not able to take care of themselves, lots of them. But that wasn't because they hadn't been prudent, hadn't saved, because there was a real problem of providing for old age. That was because of the catastrophe called the Great Depression, which was itself produced by government mismanagement. The Great Depression didn't arise out of any natural flaw in the system. It arose because some wise men sitting around in Washington and down here in Wall Street in New York decided to follow policies which reduced the quantity of money by a third over 4 years, which drove this country into an utterly unnecessary depression. Now, given the conditions you were in 33, given that the mistake had been made, I have no doubt that major social action was called for. And I really have no criticism to make of the emergency action which was undertaken at that time in the form of WPA, PWA, direct relief. I think you had to do it at that time, given the state you were in. But Social Security isn't one of those things. And I do not believe that it can be demonstrated that in the absence of Social Security, any large number of elderly people would be unable to provide for themselves. But let's look at that a little farther. Suppose that 5% of the elderly would not be able to provide for themselves. Does it make sense to impose a program on 100% of the people in order to do something about 5%? Does that really make sense? You see, that's the great defect in this line of thinking, is that the ideas that have been behind the direction we've been going in is that the people are children who have to be looked after by their paternal, by the intelligent intellectuals and governmental officials who can take care of them. That Big Brother is in Washington, and he has to look after people. Now, I think it's Big Brother that has to be looked after and not the people.
Professor Friedman, would it be fair not to use the phrase Big Brother, but to say, yes, the assumption has been that there needs to be, call it what you will, leadership, there needs to be direction, there needs to be even the coercion that you find so distasteful. Is it so totally unfair to say that we didn't live in a paradise even before the mismanagement that you claim brings about the Depression?
We didn't live in a paradise, but there is no period in human history in which the ordinary man, had as great an improvement in his lot in life as in the 19th century in the United States when the government was of trivial importance.
Then what accounted for the movements, the very strong and positive movements to bring about governmental action?
What accounted for those movements, those were fundamentally intellectual movements. They originated primarily in Britain and elsewhere. What accounted for them, I think, is a complicated story. I won't profess to give a whole answer, but I think the important part of the answer is that it's a natural human tendency to take for granted the good things that happen and to regard as the workings of the devil the bad things. And that if a bad thing comes along, you say, my God, we ought to pass a law and do something about it. That's a very natural human tendency. I think the remarkable thing, the thing that needs to be explained, is not why we've had a movement toward collectivism and toward more government control, because that's been the natural state of mankind for thousands of years. The remarkable thing, in my opinion, from an intellectual point of view, is how you ever managed to get a century or a century and a half in which the dominant philosophy was the opposite. That's the exception.
But it's